On this week's 51%, we recognize Women's History Month. We learn about the importance of women in sculpture, and Jennifer Herrera of the National Women's History Museum discusses the organization's efforts to fill the gaps in our history books.
Really, for far too long, women have been underrepresented in all areas of public life.
We also hear from the founding directors of Gender Equity and Reconciliation International about their model for gender reconciliation and healing. I'm Jesse King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Jesse King. March, as I'm sure you're aware, is Women's History Month. And with International Women's Day still in the rearview mirror, it's the perfect time to recognize all that women have achieved, how far we've come for women's rights, and how far we have to go. Our first guest today is Jennifer Herrera, the Vice President of External Affairs for the National Women's History Museum. The online institution was founded in 1996 by Karen Stacer to uncover, interpret, and celebrate women's contributions to society, and now offers extensive virtual exhibits and biographies on figures from Betsy Ross to Stacey Abrams. Herrera says it all started with one question from Stacer as she strolled the monuments and museums of Washington, D.C. Basically, where are the women?
Really, for far too long, women have been underrepresented in all areas of public life. From our currency to public sculpture to museums, and frighteningly, down to our history books. And so when you're not representing 51% of the population, you're telling an incomplete, inaccurate accounting of history. So we really exist to remedy that. Our first act was back in the 90s. Karen had learned about a monument, a big sculpture that celebrated the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And the sculpture is called the Portrait Monument, and it's of three suffragists. It kind of looks like they're sitting in a bathtub. Sometimes people call it the bathtub monument, but there are three women, and it's this really, really heavy sculpture. And the day after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, there was a huge, huge celebration in the Capitol Rotunda. And this is where this sculpture was unveiled. 5,000 people came out to celebrate women's right to vote. And what's maddening is the very next day, on orders of Congress, they moved this statue to the crypt of the United States Capitol. It's just wild to me. They were literally burying women's history on this really pivotal moment in our nation's history. And that's where it stayed for 77 years. And so our first act as a museum was to actually bring this statue back to the Capitol Rotunda. She raised the money with some other incredible women, and it was a very hard-fought battle that had been tried many times. But on Mother's Day in 1997, they finally were able to bring this statue back into its rightful home in the Capitol Rotunda, where it remains today. So it's inspiring, but it's also really upsetting to have this women's representation and the seminal moment in our country's history quite literally buried. That speaks to me, the urgency of this work. And that's one example of many.
So what does it take to close the gap? And I guess what kinds of programs and resources do you guys offer to do that?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. We did a study in 2017 called Where Are the Women? And it was a really comprehensive study that looked at women's inclusion in state social studies standards. And what we found was that, unsurprisingly, women are largely absent from our nation's history books and in our nation's classrooms. What we hear time and time again is that educators really want to incorporate women into their classrooms, but they just don't have the resources to do so. So it's not a lack of interest or a lack of wanting to make this happen, but when you have standards that don't include women, it makes it really difficult for our educators. So we fill that gap. We do virtual programming, really for all ages, from virtual field trips to Brave Girls virtual story time, where we invite an author to come in and read her book, and whole classrooms sign up and they Zoom in to these virtual story times. We have lesson plans. We have hundreds of biographies on our website. We have virtual exhibits designed for a variety of different ages that students can go and access, as can their educators. We have classroom posters. So just a whole host of resources really designed to meet this very, very pressing need.
Now, the museum is all online, but you're gearing up for your first major physical exhibit at the end of the month, so congrats on that. Tell me a little bit more about it.
Yeah, we are opening at the end of March, on March 30th, our first really, we've done smaller physical exhibits, but this is the first exhibit of this magnitude, and it's our first interactive exhibit. We are partnering with cultural institutions across the country to bring women's history to communities nationwide. So to that end, our first partnership is with DC Public Library, and we are unveiling this exhibit at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library on March 30th. And it is called We Who Believe in Freedom, Black Feminists DC. It's a very place-based exhibit that will trace Black feminism in Washington, DC from the turn of the 20th century through the civil rights and Black power movements to today. As we begin this chapter of bringing women's history across the country, we're going to, just as we did in this one, in Black Feminist DC, we're going to make sure that the exhibits in other cities are very place-based. We're partnering with like-missioned organizations to bring these, because we want to make sure that women's history is accessible, not just virtually, which we've done a really outstanding job on for 30 years, but also in person to people across the country.
Well, on that note, do you have any favorite historical figures or forgotten stories that you'd like to highlight for us?
One of our great honors has been to serve as consultants to the United States Mint on the American Women Quarters Program. There are some women that are very well known, like Maya Angelou, who was the first quarter that came out. But it's such a great opportunity for people to reach into their pockets and pull out a coin and learn the stories of other women that are perhaps not as well known as Maya Angelou. So two women that immediately spring to mind are two women in last year's series. And the first one was Nina Otero Warren. She went by Nina, and she was a suffragist in New Mexico. She was the first Hispanic woman to run for Congress, the first female superintendent of public schools in Santa Fe, and really was instrumental in the fight for the vote in New Mexico. Sometimes the story of suffrage is told through the lens of one or two women, and just like our report showed that women are largely absent, when they were included, it was one or two. But the story of the fight for the vote is so complex, and there were so many women fighting for this right, and it continued well into the 60s. So Nina's story is just so incredible, and what she was able to accomplish in the early 1900s, and her tenacity is just so inspiring. And the other woman that comes to mind is Anna May Wong, who was the first Chinese American movie star. And she was really just a woman who was very, very well known in her time, but whose story has kind of not been told. Their stories are so important because they just really represent that women have been there all along, and their stories just need to be told.
Jennifer Herrera is the Vice President of External Affairs for the National Women's History Museum. You can view all the museum has to offer at its website, womenshistory.org. And again, its physical exhibit, We Who Believe in Freedom, Black Feminist DC, opens at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library in Washington, D.C. on March 30th. Jennifer, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for shining a light on women's history and telling women's stories. Really appreciate it.
On the subject of women in sculpture, in 2020, a bronze monument recognizing leaders of the women's rights movement was unveiled in New York City's Central Park, becoming the park's first statue to depict actual women. This year, for International Women's Day, a model of the statue was formally donated to the New York State Museum in Albany. Our associate producer, Jody Cowan, stopped by the donation ceremony to learn more.
The one-third size bronze model designed by renowned sculptor Meredith Bergman features three nationally recognized leaders of the women's rights movement, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Titled the Women's Rights Pioneers Monument, the original statue was created for the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. Mark Shamming, the director of the New York State Museum, says the new model will serve as a bridge for upstate New Yorkers unable to visit the larger monument in Manhattan.
Having this one-third size model represented right here in beautiful Albany ensures that all New Yorkers will be able to see it and learn about these historically significant women.
Designer Bergman shared behind-the-scenes photos of the model's creation alongside several molds used in the creation of the original statue. She says it was an involved process bringing both monuments to their finalized forms.
A monument is made many times. It's made little, like 1 inch equals 1 foot, to go through approvals process because at that size it's easy to alter, it's easy to discuss and carry to meetings. So this is 1/3 the final height. Susan B. Anthony is 36 inches. In the park, she's 9 feet tall. So this is what happens. A team of artisans come and make these molds and wreck the studio while they're doing it. And then the molds are taken to the foundry. So people who ask me, how are you going to get this out of here, are missing this stage. I don't. I keep the clay originals. I take them apart. Then it is cast in bronze in sections. So here's poor Sojourner Truth, tack welded together, her head and hand are on the table. And I go to the foundry and make sure that all the parts fit together. And that's what's happening here. Anthony's hand is supposed to rest on Stanton's shoulder in a gesture that I hope will be ambiguous enough that viewers can decide, is she warning her, is she comforting her, whatever you would like. But it needs to touch, and bronze shrinks as it is cast, so getting that hand on that shoulder required hammering the arm and a whole bunch of other tricks that foundries have.
Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, each a suffragist who helped to secure the passage of the 19th Amendment, were also New Yorkers. Stanton was the first woman to run for Congress in 1866, presented the Declaration of Sentiments at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, and founded the National Women's Suffrage Association in New York City along with Anthony in 1869. Sojourner Truth escaped from slavery in New York in 1827 and joined the abolitionist movement, becoming one of the most important human rights advocates in United States history. She delivered her groundbreaking speech, Ain't I a Woman?, at the Women's Convention in Ohio in 1851. In a video message, Governor Kathy Hochul, the state's first female governor, reflected on their impact.
The truth is, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the trailblazing women who gathered in New York at Seneca Falls over 175 years ago. Women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott. It was there that the women's suffrage movement was truly born, with heroes like Sojourner Truth and Susan B. Anthony pushing the cause forward in the years that followed. And when more than 80 years later the goal of suffrage was still not reached, women like Alice Paul, Lucy Stone, and Ida B. Wells picked up the baton. New York would become one of the first states to grant women full suffrage in 1917, and the U.S. 19th Amendment would follow 2 years later. And civil rights activists continued to fight for decades after to allow every American access to the ballot box, no matter their race or ethnicity. It's extraordinary what these women did. I'm reminded of their bravery, strength, and unrelenting commitment to equality every single day.
In addition to serving as an upstate complement to the original monument, Ashley Hopkins Benton, New York State Museum senior historian and curator, says the new model is part of an upcoming exhibit at the New York State Museum specifically devoted to the accomplishments of women like Truth, Anthony, and Stanton. The exhibit, Women Who Lead, opening March 11th, will bring together objects and artworks highlighting women across New York State.
In June of 2021, the New York State Museum was pleased to accept a gift from Monumental Women of some of the molds used to cast the Women's Rights Pioneer Monument in Central Park for our collection, and you can see 2 examples here today. We were excited to have these tangible artifacts to tell the story of the tremendous and groundbreaking work that went into placing the first statue of real women in Central Park, an important piece of New York women's history in its own right.
While remaining a celebratory event, the struggles of women historically and the systemic resistance to equality were also highlighted. Pam Alam, president of the nonprofit Monumental Women, spoke on the organization's commitment to breaking the bronze ceiling.
The 42 million people who visit Central Park each year already see statues of Alice in Wonderland and Juliet with Romeo. Now Central Park visitors can see some real monumental women. Thousands of people have already accessed our app, Talking Statues, to hear the words of Truth, Anthony, and Stanton while they view the images of those incredible women. But creating the Women's Rights Pioneers Monument is only one of the goals of Monumental Women. In addition, we seek to increase the awareness and appreciation of women's history through our education campaign, as well as our challenge to municipalities all across the nation and the world. We urge cities to reimagine their public spaces, to include tributes to the diverse women who helped create and inspire them.
Public viewing of the Women's Rights Pioneers Central Park Monument model is currently available in the front lobby of the New York State Museum ahead of its placement as part of the Women Who Lead exhibit. Again, the new exhibit opens on Saturday, March 11th. For 51%, this is Jody Cowan.
Thank you, Jody. While we have come a long way in terms of women's rights, we still live in a largely patriarchal society that is rife with gender violence and discrimination, pay gaps and glass ceilings, and hostility towards those who live outside gender norms. Our last guests today consider the gender divide one of the world's most ancient wounds, and they've been working to address it with workshops on gender reconciliation and healing for 30 years. Cynthia Bricks and William Keepin are the founding directors of Gender Equity and Reconciliation International, a not-for-profit project with more than 200 facilitators across 18 countries. Both say they came to this work after recognizing sexual harassment and assault in their workplaces. And in their new book, simply titled Gender Equity and Reconciliation, they share their method for bringing people of all genders together to share their pain, better understand one another, and hopefully work towards solving gender injustice on a larger scale. Just a note to some of our listeners before we start, this interview does discuss sensitive subjects like sexual assault.
The project actually started 30 years ago, and Will can share more about the creation of that and how that formed and everything. My entry point into the work was about 23 years ago, but the timing was quite interesting because 1 month after my workshop, which was very powerful, I was working in a corporation, health and wellness. I had just completed my graduate degree, was working with a world-renowned health and wellness expert in Indianapolis, and he sexually propositioned me. Over dinner, he said, "Cynthia, I've enjoyed getting to know you. Now it's time to take our relationship to a deeper, more intimate sexual level." I said no, and he continued to pressure me. So it was my Me Too story 23 years ago. And everything I had built up to that point just came shattering down. I was a single mother. How was I going to do this? Thankfully, I had family support. I had ways of saying no, and I eventually got pushed out of that corporation because I did bring it forward. They hired 6 attorneys to bring me down. It was shattering. But over the course of time, first of all, when I got pushed out, I didn't trust men. I didn't feel right in my body. I didn't know how to be in my body. And so it took time to heal. It took a lot of therapy. And I eventually, over the course of time, was able to move my outrage and my distrust into a place of deeper understanding and compassion, recognizing we're all in this system together of oppression, and we need to retrain ourselves and retool ourselves and be in safe environments to actually do deeper healing. So that's how I was launched into this work 23 years ago. And maybe, Will, you can pick it up and just share about how it actually got started.
I, by training, was a climate scientist working on sustainable energy and renewable energy as strategies for abating global warming. So it's part of kind of the mainstream environmental movement. And there was basically sexual harassment and shenanigans going on. So a group of us decided to address this issue within our professional network, and having no idea what we were opening. The first events we did were not exactly disasters, but the magnitude of what we unleashed overwhelmed our little design. And so we realized, and we were doing this as in-house with colleagues, so we could be experimental, we could try things. And so we began a whole series of explorations. How can we work with these issues and address them skillfully within our professional network? So that's how we got started. And then we basically, over the next few years, began to find skillful ways of working with these issues. We quickly found out that dialogue alone is not enough. We needed full, embodied, and somatic transformative methodologies to work with. And then after about 4 years, we began to get invitations from outside our networks. And that was when we really had to think about, are we prepared to take this on the road? We particularly got interest from academics, from progressive academics, from therapists, from clergy. So we began to offer this program back in the mid-90s. And at that time, we were very inspired by what was happening in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with Desmond Tutu and the hearings that were taking place. And we realized we need the same thing with gender. We need a gender reconciliation, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so we actually changed the name of the work to Gender Reconciliation at that time. We never dreamed that we would ever go to South Africa, much less meet Desmond Tutu. That was not at all in our minds. It was just that we were inspired by their work and we were basically implementing it in this other arena. So that's how it got started. And then after that, it just continued to slow, steady grow. In 2001, we got invited to India for the first time. In 2003, we got invited to South Africa. In 2006, we got invited by the Deputy Minister of Health in South Africa to do a high-level event for members of parliament and other senior leaders. And that was a watershed moment for us because that led to invitations all over the country after that. And so then the work just began to grow and expand from there.
Now, in these workshops that you're doing, like, to help us get a little bit of a picture of how it works, like, what is your model like for helping people on the road of gender healing and reconciliation?
We like to often quote the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who said, "Injustice and corruption will never be transformed by keeping them hidden, but only by bringing them out into the light and confronting them with the power of love." That's what we do in our methodology. We speak truth to what our experience is on an individual level around gender and sexuality. And we do it without shame or blame. We do it with compassion and with love. And it's still hard truths. It's oftentimes very difficult to hear these things. But as soon as we are able to do that and do it in community, that community healing aspect's very important because so many of the violations happen in community, whether it's out in the public realm of whether you feel safe walking on the streets, or it's in the family, or it's in the boardroom, in the corporate setting. It doesn't matter. Unfortunately, we often say it's from the bedroom to the boardroom that these gender issues are happening. In the practicality of it, our work is very experiential. We are a training organization. We have many skilled facilitators and trainers. None of us claim to be experts in gender. And the first part of our program, whether it's online or in person, is creating safety, as much safety as possible, getting to know each other, but also having and establishing community agreements that we live by. And it doesn't mean sometimes those are breached, but we come back together and we deal with them. And then we do a silent witnessing process that, we stand if the question is true for us. So one of the questions for women, identified people, is please stand if you've ever felt unsafe walking the streets alone because you are a woman. And then we ask the same for the male identified people. And we ask the same question for those who are gender non-binary or gender fluid, queer. And it shows that there's a difference there, and the same is true that how many men identified people fear going to war and how many people don't have to fear that because it's not part of their reality. That's a gender issue. So we do that process. Then we move into deeper experiences of sharing our stories, our gender river of life. We move into truth forms where one group will be in the center and the other group on the outside, and we witness and listen. The outside circle just listens deeply while the other people just share the truth of their experience. And one key difference in our work, while we go very deeply into the experiences we have, and we do it not as victims, but as witnesses to our story, We share practices to stay centered, to stay regulated. So it's not anywhere do we want to re-stimulate trauma. That is not the purpose. It's really to liberate ourselves and free ourselves from the shackles that bind us in our story. And I will say the patriarchy wants those stories to stay quiet, wants them to stay invisible. And if they come out, like the Me Too movement that we witnessed, when they start coming out, the structures that keep these stories and the gender oppression in place start to crumble. And so we create that safe space for those stories to come forward. And then one uniqueness of our program is that once we go into that depth, we know we can't stay there forever. And we come and we do honoring ceremonies, honoring and consecrating all the truths that have been shared. And that's a unique piece of our work, because oftentimes truths are shared, but we don't really do the honoring piece of saying what courage it took to share that, and what courage it took for the other people to really listen and hear those challenging stories.
What do you usually find people, learning about each other through this experience?
Oh, that's a great question. What we've discovered working across all the cultures that we've worked, there are certain patterns that are consistent. Men, all the time, we hear, I knew that women, have these issues. I'm aware of the statistics. I had no idea what they actually go through. There was one man in one of our workshops who led men's work. He was very astute. He's a Buddhist. And he came to our workshop and he was blown away by the women's stories. And he went home to his wife of 30 years and he said to her, this was such an amazing revelation. And he said, I am so grateful that you never had to live through any of these experiences. And she just looked at him. She said, what are you talking about? Are you a crazy man? And she basically told him things she had never told him in 30 years of marriage. So what we've learned is there's a level of truth-telling that is not happening in the culture. And the vice versa is also the case. Women always come out of this work saying, I always assume that men have all the advantages. They have the power, the patriarchy is in their favor. They don't have any real issues. And they realize how much men suffer in this system. And how, as Bell Hooks says so beautifully, men are required to self-mutilate part of their humanity as young boys and men. And if they don't do it, the culture and their peers will do it to them. So what happens is that men realize how much women suffer, women realize how much men suffer, and heteronormative people realize how much LGBTQ and queer people suffer in this culture this toxic gender system that we're all conditioned by. And I'll just give you one example because it's a beautiful story. There was a man, 24 years old, beautiful man in our program, and he liked the first one. So he came back to the advanced one. And in the advanced one, there was a woman who, at one point during the Truth Forum that Cynthia mentioned, she told her story of a really horrific story of being raped only some months earlier. And she'd come to our work partly to prepare herself to face her rapist in court. And she really spoke to the actual shattering experience of what it actually is like. And there was pin drop silence afterwards. And this man was the first who spoke. And he said, I don't know how to be a man anymore. I feel traumatized. And we worked with him and helped him to understand the reason he felt traumatized was because he had really opened his heart to receive this woman's story, and he had taken into his own heart part of her pain. And so now part of her pain was his pain. And this is the transformative moment, because when we experience the pain of the other as our own pain, then we and the other are both transformed thereby. And so it was a very profound turning point in his young man life, and he then a year later, he actually joined our professional facilitator training. And now he's one of the facilitators of our work. Yeah, so that's an example of kind of what people learn in this work.
I really liked how you put that, just sort of like having to open yourselves up to other people's pain to allow that transformation to happen. Because I was going to ask, like, how do you feel that, sessions like these can help on a broader scale us addressing gender injustice or gender violence?
What we're trying to do is get these programs widely implemented. We had a research study that was done for 2 years at the University of the Free State and Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And the conclusion of that study was this kind of program should be mandatory for all freshmen entering the university everywhere. Because basically what we need is a level of truth-telling that is not happening anywhere and is needed everywhere. And when that happens, what is so beautiful is we witness the power of the human spirit, that even in a few days, one of our lessons that we've learned in this work, sometimes we put it this way, thousands of years of patriarchy begin to crumble even within a few days of doing this deep work together, because they cannot withstand the twin forces of truth and love.
In some of our programs, I'll speak specifically about some men will come and they will have heard their partner, their wife, their girlfriend in particular, say something, like this is her experience. And they maybe don't fully believe that that's really what's going on. But then when they hear many women speak about the same thing, and the other side is that women or queer people hear, or straight people hear queer people or whatever, this is my experience. And it's not just one person, but it's a collective of people. That's where so much healing can happen, because we read about things in the newspaper, but we don't necessarily know these people. And we might be sympathetic to what's going on, but they're not people we've gotten to know and become friends with. A researcher and professor at Stellenbosch University, Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela, she was actually the psychologist that during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that brought the perpetrator and the victims together for healing. She's the one that oversaw the research project that happened on our work. And she says, what we most need now is to make public spaces intimate. And I think that the Me Too movement did that in a way. What's missing, though, are the other voices, whether they be men or whether they be queer or trans people or whoever. And it also, where is the honoring piece? Okay, thank you for your courage for speaking. Making public spaces intimate, though. Isn't that beautiful? I guarantee you, whenever any of us go to a dinner party or anything and someone says, what do you do? And we say, it totally shifts the conversation. The whole evening becomes gender stories.
Well, you say that the current system betrays everybody involved in it. What are some of the things that you've heard about the ways that the system has betrayed them on all fronts?
Yeah, well, first of all, for women, they feel betrayed by the objectification culture. We hear that a lot. They feel betrayed by the glass ceiling, by the disempowerment, not only of their feminine voice and leadership, but even of feminine ways of understanding and knowing. The whole rational scientific model of truth, for example, de-emphasizes feminine epistemologies, feminine ways of knowing, and emphasizes more masculine. So that's one subset. The LGBTQ community feel profoundly marginalized, less safe, and also incredibly judged. Some of our facilitators who are in that community, one of them is a minister, and he spends so much of his time actually in private sessions with queer people, helping them to realize that they too are made in the image of God, working within the churches, that deep introjected guilt and shame that they feel because they don't fit into the heteronormative systems is not their fault. It's the system's fault. And then men, the suffering that men undergo, one thing that men learn in our work is that the greatest male privilege is not any of the social advantages afforded to men, higher pay, and the greatest male privilege is to actively participate in deconstructing this whole patriarchal system itself and collaborate skillfully and joyfully and creatively with all other people, with women, with LGBTQ, with people of all races, And what we've learned, and this is really important, yes, there are some men who are very toxic and dangerous and violent. The vast majority of men don't want that system. They don't want that socialization. They so love the possibility of having a new way of relating to other human beings, to women, to people of all gender identities, but they have never been shown how, and they've never been given a chance. And to me, that's one of the most hopeful things that happens in our work, because towards the end of our program, we don't just wallow in all the pain, because it's deep, but then we complete that part of our program, and then we move into another whole part where we do the honoring of one another. And we basically celebrate the fact that we've come here to do this work together. And we do this in a way, for example, when we do it with the men and women, they are each given the task of honoring the other. And the things they come up with are just astounding. So like in one case, the men came up with a ceremony to honor the feminine by restoring the sovereignty of the feminine to women that was stolen from them. And they built a whole throne. I mean, this is during the program. They built this kind of throne that they had, and they adorned it with, and across the top it said "Throne of the Divine Feminine." And then they invited each woman individually, and they escorted her to sit in that throne. And then they all kneeled before her and spoke about her gifts. And the women were just like blown away, because they felt the sincerity of that giving back the power that had been stolen from them. And this is what they came up with. We have seen just all kinds of remarkable ceremonies. And what happens then is that the veils of separation drop away. Male, female, queer, straight, they drop away. We see each other soul to soul, and we reconnect with that fundamental oneness of the human spirit, which is the essence of the human family, is that we are all one. This is why we were so inspired when we got to meet with Desmond Tutu. And he got interested in our work because we were applying the same principles to gender that he had applied to racial healing. And so we formed a partnership. And what he emphasizes is that humanity is all one family. And these gender differences that we've made so much big deal of and have created oppressive structures around are all just made of clay. They just crumble in the face of that power of the truth of our oneness.
Outside the workshops, if you're trying to have more of these conversations or to create safer spaces within your family or within your friend groups and stuff like that, are there ways you can bring it into your everyday life a little bit more?
Great question. I mean, I often say that the community agreements alone, if we all just lived by the community agreements of confidentiality, creating safe space and healing environment, honoring our process, just being mindful and aware and conscientious about what we speak, what we say, how we act, it would be a totally different world. There's simple practices in some ways. It's really being aware and conscious and bringing more consciousness in those environments. It's not easy. And I will say, even within our relationships, my relationship, Will's relationships, and some of our facilitators, with family members, sometimes something's going on, and we've got to be mindful about speaking truth, because if we do, it can also bring a lot of clash and conflict. Navigating the spaces can be difficult if not everybody in the family wants to be in the same place as you.
Yes, and it has to be applied cautiously and mindfully. In our work, people come specifically for doing this work, so we're able to go to a level of truth-telling that's very deep. But if we just launch off into our other networks and start speaking at that level and start inviting others to speak at that level, you're basically inviting them into a whole cultural transformational process that they may not be prepared for it. They may feel offended by even the possibility that they should speak about some of these more private issues. The answer is definitely long-term. There's no question that this work applies in our daily lives. People who have done a lot of our work find that they are able to enter in those conversations outside of our work fairly effectively, but they've also learned from experience, when and how to do it and when not to.
It goes back for me in terms of spiritual practice. You know, if I meditate each day, if I'm trying to become more conscious, as I change myself, then my environment changes around me. I don't need to actually go out and try to change someone else. I just need to show up in all of who I am and walk in the world in a peaceful, loving, and conscious way.
Cynthia Bricks and William Keepan are the founding directors of Gender Equity and Reconciliation International, which has been offering workshops and programs on gender healing across 6 continents for 30 years. Their website is genderreconciliationinternational.org, and their book on the subject, with 20 co-authors across 10 countries, is Gender Equity and Reconciliation: 30 Years Healing the Most Ancient Wound in the Human Family. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jessie, and thank you for the work you're doing. I think it's a very important service to bring these kinds of programs to a wider awareness. So deep gratitude to you for your work.
You've been listening to 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jessie King. Our associate producer is Jody Cowan. Our executive producer is Dr. Alan Chartock. And our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. A big thanks to Jennifer Herrera, Cynthia Bricks, and William Keepan for taking the time to speak with us this week. To learn more about our guests and the topics discussed on this show, again, check us out at our flagship station's website. That's WAMCpodcasts.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jessie King for 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. At night, down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool.